Hey everyone, so now we're going to be talking about inverse functions. And inverse functions are basically like the inverse of a function or the opposite of a function. When we graph them, they flip over or are reflected across a line. We use inverse functions every once in a while for real world things, but mostly we just want to make sure that you are able to do some really cool algebra. So let me just show you kind of really fast. If I have this equation that, let's say, looks like um, this, and I wanted to find the inverse of it, or graph the inverse of it, what I do is I actually draw this horizontal line at x or y equals x, and then I reflect it over again, or flip it over it, and it goes like this. So if this is my original function, which we're going to call fx, then this is my inverse function, which we call f of -1 of x. That's how you write inverse. So that's what it looks like on a graph. You will not have to graph these, but I just wanted to show you what they look like. So let's go through an example. What I am going to ask you to do is to just find the inverse functions. So let's say I have this function, f of x equals 5x plus 1, and I tell you to find the inverse. So if you remember from the last video, we talked about how f of x is just another name for y when it's a function. So I can actually write this as y equals 5x plus 1. And the reason why I want to do that is because it's going to make the next step way easier. So when we find the inverse function, what we do is we flip-flop the x and the y. So instead of writing y equals 5x plus 1, I write x equals 5y plus 1. So I just switched where the x was and where the y was. Now, that's not your answer yet, but we're really close because the next step, or the very last step to do, is to actually just solve it for y. So to solve this for y, I want to get y by itself, which means I'm going to subtract 1 from each side. And I get x minus 1 equals 5y. Still want to get y by itself, so I'm going to get rid of the 5 by dividing everything by 5. And I would get, in fact, I could write it a couple of different ways, but I'm going to write it in the easier way. Sorry. X minus 1 all divided by 5 equals y. So I told you that I could write it in a couple different ways. Write it like this in just one big fraction. Inverse functions tend to be a little bit nastier, like they don't look as pretty. So if we leave it in a big fraction, that's totally cool. And then what, because remember we replaced the fx with the y, so what we're going to do now is just go back and replace the y with what we know the inverse sign is, which is f to the power of -1 of x. That just means that it's the inverse function is x minus 1 over 5. And there we have it. That's our answer for inverse. Okay, let's just go through a couple more examples. So the second example is g of x equals -2x squared plus 3 all divided by 7. So once again, first step is I'm going to replace the gx with y. The reason why I think it makes it easier is because it's easier to say, oh, I'm just going to solve that for y instead of I'm going to solve that for gx, because sometimes you get confused when there's multiple variables. So now we're going to flip-flop the x and the y. So it becomes x equals -2y squared plus 3 over 7. And now we have to just solve for y. So to solve for y, the first thing I want to do is get rid of this fraction. I don't like fractions. It's easier to work without them. So I'm going to get rid of the 7 by multiplying each side by 7. When I multiply the left side by 7, I just get 7x. When I multiply the right side by 7, the 7's cancel out. And I'm left with -2y squared plus 3. Then, still want to get y by itself, so I'm going to subtract 3 from each side. Then I'm going to divide everything by -2. And once again, you can kind of just divide this whole chunk, like the whole side, by -2, so that you can write it as 7x minus 3, over negative 2 equals y squared. And we want to get rid of the squared. Now, what's opposite of squared is square root. So what we're going to do is square root each side. And what that would do is it would give us 7x minus 3 divided by negative 2, all square rooted, equals y. Because the square and the square root on the right side cancel each other out. And so your final answer, if we put it in the correct form with the inverse notation, we'd say f to the power of negative 1 of x equals the square root of x minus, or oh my goodness, I keep on forgetting the x, 7x minus 3 over negative 2. One other thing, when you square root something, it's always plus or minus. So you might just want to tack on a plus or minus there. There we have it. All right, let's go through another example. So this one says f, oh, not f. Let's try that again. hx equals 1 over x plus 4. So once again, first step, replace the hx with y. Second step, flip-flop the x and the y. Third step, solve for y. This is a little bit weird, but the first thing I'm going to tell you is that I really don't like fractions. So the first thing I'm going to do is get rid of the fraction by multiplying the bottom up. So I'm going to multiply each side by y plus 4. I can multiply by that whole chunk because that whole chunk is on the bottom. So then I'm going to have x times y plus 4. I'm going to put y plus 4 in parentheses because the x is multiplying the whole thing, not just the y and not just the 4. So when it's multiplying that whole thing like that, you want to put it in parentheses. And then the y plus 4's on the right side cancel out, and we're just left with 1. Okay, so if the goal is to solve for y, we've got to get rid of the x and we've got to get rid of the 4. Normally, I would get rid of the 4 first because it's adding, but in this case, because the x is multiplying the whole thing, both the y and the 4, we want to get rid of the x first. It's multiplying, so to get rid of it, we're going to divide each side by x. So the x's on the left side cancel out, and we're just left with y plus 4. Then on the right side, we'd have 1 divided by x, which we have to leave 1 over x. There's no way to simplify that. Okay, and now we still want to solve for y, so we can get rid of the 4 just by subtracting it. And we'd end up with y is equal to, 4's cancel out here, 1 over x minus 4. And there we have it. That's our, oh, I lied. Not our inverse yet because we need to put it in the right form. So the right form would be f to the power of negative 1 of x equals 1 over x minus 4. There we have it, our inverse. Okay, let's just do one more example. And this example is f of x equals the square root of x minus 8 plus 5. So, step 1, switch the f of x to a y. Step 2, flip-flop the x and the y. Step 3, solve for y. So notice how the 8 and the 5, like that, they look like common terms, or common terms, but because the 8's inside the square root and the 5 isn't, we can't actually combine them. So what we're going to do is get rid of them separately. The first one we're going to get rid of is the 5, and we're going to get rid of the 5 by subtracting it from each side. So the 5's on the right side cancel out, and I'm left with x minus 5 equals the square root of y minus 8. Now, I can't get rid of the 8 yet because the 8's inside the square root, you have to get rid of the square root first. Just like the opposite of squaring is square root, the opposite of square root is squaring. So what we're going to do is square both sides. So the way I would write it is x minus 5 in parentheses squared equals y minus 8. The reason why we have to put the x minus 5 in parentheses is because we're not just squaring the x and we're not just squaring the 5, we're squaring both the x and the 5. So you have to put it in parentheses like that. Then you still want to get the y by itself, so we're going to add 8 to each side. And we'd have x minus 5 squared plus 8. You can't combine that 5 and 8 again because one's squared and one's not, equals y. You could potentially FOIL this chunk out and simplify it down a little bit. But because of this is inverse, and because inverses tend to be a little bit nastier, like we talked about, we can just leave it like this. So our final answer is f to the power of negative 1 of x equals x minus 5 squared plus 8. And there we have it, inverse